My expert son-in-law offered to help me with a deal. His help almost cost me $3.1 million. You spend your whole life teaching kids shop class, and the first rule you drill into their thick skulls is simple. Measure twice, cut once. It's a good rule for woodworking. Hell, it's a good rule for life. Too bad the doctors who looked at my heart must have skipped that lesson entirely. My name's Daniel, though most folks just call me Dan. I'm 60 years old, been a widower for 3 years now, and I teach with shop at the local high school here in Maine. Been doing it for 37 years. Same classroom, same smell of pine shavings and teenage disappointment. You know that smell, sawdust mixed with Axe body spray, and broken dreams. The kids change, but the smell stays the same. I've got this workshop behind my house. Nothing fancy, just a converted barn where I make furniture nobody wants to buy. And then there's the garage. Oh boy, the garage. That's where my old man's collection lives. Or lived, I should say. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My father was a forest ranger up in Baxter State Park for 40 years. Good man, honest as the day is long. But somewhere around 1970, he developed what my late wife Mary called an unhealthy relationship with other people's garbage. Dad called it hunting for history. He'd hit every estate sale, garage sale, barn sale, and flea market within a 100-mile radius. Came home with truck beds full of what looked like props from a horror movie about tetanus. The garage became his personal museum of forgotten America. Rusty farm tools that hadn't touched soil since the Depression. Glass fishing floats that probably never saw the ocean. Wooden decoys so beat up they looked like they'd been through a blender. And boxes. God almighty, the boxes. Stacked floor to ceiling, labeled in his neat engineer's handwriting. Might be valuable 1973 or research later 1981. Mary tolerated it. That woman was a saint. She'd just shake her head and say, "Tom, one day this garage is going to collapse under the weight of your optimism." She was wrong about the collapse part. The garage outlasted both of them. Dad went first, stroke in 2018. Mary followed 2 years later. Cancer, the kind that doesn't care how much you measure or how carefully you cut. After Mary passed, I couldn't bring myself to clean out that garage. Every time I opened the door, I'd see Dad sorting through his treasures, hear him explaining why this particular piece of junk was going to be worth something someday. Grief is funny that way. It turns a garage full of garbage into a shrine. Then came the bill, not for the garage, for my heart. Turns out, while I was busy teaching teenagers the difference between a dovetail and a finger joint, my ticker was slowly giving up the ghost. Needed what the cardiologist called immediate surgical intervention. Translation: crack your chest open like a lobster and rebuild the plumbing before the whole system backs up permanently. The good news? They could fix me. The bad news? My spectacular teacher's insurance covered what they generously call basic cardiac care. What I needed was apparently enhanced cardiac intervention. The difference between basic and enhanced? $80,000. Cash. 80 grand. That's more than I make in 2 years. Hell, it's more than my house is worth in this economy. You ever get that feeling where you realize you're too poor to live, but not quite poor enough for anyone to give a damn? Like you're stuck in this weird purgatory where you make just enough money to disqualify you from help, but not enough to actually help yourself? That's where I was. Standing in my kitchen, holding that estimate, wondering if maybe the smart move was to just let nature take its course. But then I thought about Sarah, my daughter, my only kid, and I did what I swore I'd never do. I called her. Asking your own kid for money is like trying to nail Jell-O to a wall. Messy, pointless, and everybody ends up disappointed. But I was desperate, and desperation makes you do things that shame tastes like later. Sarah answered on the second ring. "Dad, everything okay?" Everything was not okay. Everything was roughly $80,000 away from okay. She drove up from Boston the next day, 5 hours in Friday traffic, which told me she was worried. Sarah doesn't do Friday traffic for anybody. She pulled up in that Tesla her husband bought her, one of those spaceship-looking things that probably cost more than I made in the last 3 years combined. She wasn't alone. Richard stepped out of the passenger side, adjusting his sport coat like he was about to praise something, which it turns out he was. Let me tell you about my son-in-law, Richard. He's 38, got one of those haircuts that cost more than my monthly groceries, and describes himself as a consultant in alternative investments. That's fancy talk for a guy who convinces rich people to buy other rich people stuff. Art, antiques, collectibles, anything that can be described as an asset class and sold to someone with more money than sense. Sarah met him 3 years ago when she was drowning in student loans from her MBA program, $150,000 in debt for a piece of paper that got her a job making less than I do teaching shop. Richard swooped in like some kind of financial Superman, consolidated her loans, invested her pitiful savings in God knows what, and somehow made that debt disappear within 18 months. Now she looks at him like he invented money itself. Me? She loves me, sure. The way you love an old dog that keeps peeing on the carpet. You feel bad for it. You remember when it was young and useful, but mostly you're just waiting for the inevitable. Her old man, the shop teacher who never learned the difference between portfolio and a pork chop. The guy whose idea of investment planning was buying lumber when it was on sale. They sat at my kitchen table. The one I made myself from reclaimed barnwood. Not that Richard noticed. And Sarah held my hand while I explained the situation. The surgery. The insurance gap. The impossible number. Richard leaned back in his chair. That specific lean that says, I'm about to solve your little problem, you simple fool. He pulled out his phone, probably worth more than my truck, and started tapping. Daniel, he said, and I hate how he says my name, like it's a word he learned phonetically. 80,000 is serious capital. Sarah's concerned. Obviously. We want to help. That we hit different. Like Sarah's concern was now community property. He kept tapping on his phone, probably calculating how many yacht payments 80 grand represented. I've reviewed your assets. The house is mortgaged to the hilt. Your pension is, well, it's a teacher's pension. Your savings are negligible. Thanks for the recap, Dick. I mean, Richard. Then his eyes landed on the garage, visible through the kitchen window. The corners of his mouth twitched upward, like a snake that just spotted a mouse. However, he said, dragging that word out like he was about to reveal the location of the Holy Grail, you do have one underutilized asset. Sarah squeezed my hand. Hope flickered in her eyes. God help me. She thought her husband was about to save the day. Again, Richard stood up, walked a window, and gazed at Dad's garage like Christopher Columbus looking at the New World. That garage is full of what we in the business call distressed inventory. Your father was a collector, yes? He collected, yeah, I said, collected everything that nobody else wanted. Collected promises that someday, somehow, all that junk would mean something. I'm prepared to make you an offer, Richard announced, turning around like he was on stage. I'll liquidate the contents of that garage. Full cleanout. In exchange, I'll give you $5,000. Cash. Today. $5,000. For 30 years of my father's hunting. Sarah's face lit up like Christmas morning. Dad, that's amazing. $5,000 for all that stuff. And you won't have to deal with cleaning it out. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her. She genuinely believed her husband was doing me a favor. In her mind, Richard was practically a philanthropist, taking worthless junk off her helpless father's hands and even paying him for the privilege. It's a generous offer, Richard added, checking his Apple Watch like he had somewhere more important to be, which he probably did. Fair market value for that kind of accumulation is essentially zero. Most people would charge you for removal. You know that moment when you're about to make a cut in a piece of wood, and you can feel in your bones that the angle is wrong, that if you push that saw forward, you're going to ruin everything? But you're tired, and the day's been long, and everybody's watching, waiting for you to just get it done already? That's where I was, sitting at my own kitchen table, in the house I'd probably lose anyway if I didn't get this surgery, with my daughter's hopeful face breaking my heart worse than any clogged artery ever could. The garage has sentimental value, I said weakly. Richard's smile was patient, practiced, the smile of a man who'd heard every objection and overcome them all. Sentiment doesn't pay medical bills, Daniel. This is $5,000 you don't have. It's not the full amount, obviously, but it's a start. Sarah and I will figure out the rest. There it was. The hook. They'd figure out the rest. Make me their charity case. Their good deed. Every Christmas for the rest of my life. I'd be the father-in-law they saved. The old man who couldn't even die without their help. But Sarah was nodding, tears in her eyes. Please, Dad, let us help. Let Richard help. It's just stuff. Mom wouldn't want you to choose stuff over your life. My wife's name in my daughter's mouth. Mary wouldn't want this. Mary wanted to live. Mary would probably have cleaned out that garage years ago, turned it into an art studio or a greenhouse or something actually useful. I looked at Richard's hand, extended across my kitchen table. Manicured nails. Probably never had a splinter in his life. Everything about him screamed success, competence, capability. Everything I wasn't. Everything I'd failed to become. I need some time to think, I said. Of course, Richard said, but he pulled out his checkbook anyway. One of those leather-bound things that rich people still use even though nobody needs checks anymore. He wrote it out slowly, deliberately. $5,000. Made out to Daniel McKinnon. He said on the table between us, "This offer expires when I leave today. I have estate sales every weekend. If you want my help, it needs to be now." Sarah's grip on my hand tightened. Her eyes begged me. You know what the second rule of woodworking is? Never cut when you're tired. Your hands shake. Your judgment goes to hell, and you make mistakes you can't take back. But there I was, exhausted down to my bones, with my daughter's heart breaking in real time, and that check sitting there like a life raft made of newspaper. Okay, I heard myself say. Richard's smile widened. Sarah exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for hours. Wonderful. I'll have my crew here tomorrow morning. 8 sharp. My crew. Not him personally. Of course. Richard didn't do his own dirty work. He had people for that. People who would tear through my father's 30 years of careful collecting, like locusts through wheat. They shook hands, Richard and Sarah, celebrating their successful intervention. I just sat there, holding that check, feeling something inside me break that had nothing to do with my heart. $5,000. That's what my father's dreams were worth. That's what 30 years of someday this will be valuable came down to. A check that wouldn't even cover the anesthesia for my surgery. They left right after, Sarah promising to call every day, Richard already on his phone, no doubt arranging tomorrow's assault on my garage. I just sat there at my own kitchen table, holding that check, $5,000. That's what 30 years of someday this will be valuable came down to, a check that wouldn't even cover the anesthesia for my surgery. I'd just broken the carpenter's second rule, the most important one. Never, ever cut when you're tired. Richard's crew arrived at 8 sharp. 2 guys who looked like they moonlighted as bouncers and a skinny kid with an iPad. They worked fast. Too fast. They weren't packing. They were harvesting. Richard had a system. Thumbs up meant it went in the truck. Thumbs down meant the trash pile. There were a lot more thumbs down than up. About an hour in, Richard found the wooden duck decoys. Dad had maybe 2 dozen of them, all in various states of decay. One caught his attention, better condition than the others, original paint intact. Dark green head, brown body. Richard held it up to the light, and I swear I saw his pupils dilate. The kid with the iPad shuffled over, and Richard whispered something to him. The kid started typing furiously. I walked out there, trying to look casual. Asked if the duck might be worth something. Richard's smile turned condescending, like explaining to a child why they can't have candy for dinner. He launched into the speech about market value and authentication, and something called provenance. According to him, the duck was mass-produced, maybe worth $100 on eBay if you found the right tourist. He set aside, though, not in the truck, not in the trash pile, its own special category that he'd deal with later. Then Richard ventured into the back corner of the garage, the graveyard section. Behind a stack of moldy lobster traps sat something that looked like it had lost a fight with both time and with Chipper, a goose decoy. Huge, maybe 3 feet long, covered in moss, spider webs, and bird crap. Its paint had mostly flaked off. One I was missing entirely. The other stared out accusingly. Richard approached it like you'd approach a dead skunk. He nudged it with his $400 boot. The goose rocked slightly, revealing a cracked base. He actually laughed, called it worthless, said it wasn't even good for firewood, told me to leave it for garbage pickup. The iPad kid made a note, probably writing giant piece of crap in their database. They finished by noon. Richard handed me the check with a flourish, $5,000. Sarah was there, telling me how proud she was that I was taking care of myself. That Richard was so good at this stuff, that I was lucky to have him in the family. Lucky? Yeah. They drove off, Sarah in her Tesla, Richard in his BMW, the crew in the truck full of my father's memories. I stood, waving like an idiot, playing the grateful father-in-law. When they were gone, I went back to the garage. It looked violated, like someone had performed an autopsy, but forgot to sew the body back up. I sat on an old milk crate and stared at that check. $5,000. It felt heavier than it should, like those pieces of silver in Judas's pocket. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, highlighting dust motes in the air. Dust from my father's boxes, from 30 years of collecting. Now just particles drifting nowhere. I needed to do something. Anything. So I started cleaning up the mess Richard had deemed unworthy. That's when I really looked at that ugly goose. Richard was right about one thing. It was spectacularly ugly, but it was heavy. Heavier than it should be. Most decoys are hollow or lightweight. This thing felt carved from a single piece of hardwood. I dragged it toward the door, planning to haul it to the curb. When I lifted it, something shifted underneath. A small tin box, the kind your grandmother might have kept buttons in. Inside was an old fishing license from 1972. My father's name, Thomas McKinnon. And underneath, a small letter ledger no bigger than a passport. The rubber band holding it closed disintegrated when I touched it. I opened it carefully. Dad's handwriting filled the pages. That same precise engineer script he'd learned in college before he decided trees were more interesting than bridges. But this wasn't engineering. This was archaeology. A record of every single thing he'd bought at those sales, complete with dates, prices, and notes. The entries went back to 1970. The very first one, written in blue ink that had faded to gray. January 3rd, 1970. Warsaw Community Center. Box of doorknobs. Mostly brass. $3. Mary says I'm an idiot. I smiled despite myself. Mom had been calling him an idiot from day one, apparently. I flipped through the pages. Each entry told a tiny story. February 15th, 1971. Portland Flea Market. Glass fishing floats, 12 count, $20. Japanese. Seller claimed they were from his grandfather's boat. Probably lying, but good story. Or August 9th, 1973. Camden estate sale. Wooden toolbox with initials EW, $8. Tools inside worth more than box, but box is why I bought it. Page after page of purchases, each one meticulously recorded. Dad had treated this like a scientist documenting specimens. Date, location, purchase price, description, and usually some personal note. April 4th, 1975. Bangor. Moose antlers. $15. Mary threatened divorce if I hung them in living room. They're in garage. I kept reading, lost in my father's secret history. This wasn't junk collecting. This was his journal, his diary written in transactions. Each entry was a day he'd gone out into the world looking for something valuable that everyone else had missed. Then I got in 1972, and one entry made my breath catch. September 18th, 1972. Barnstable, Massachusetts. Wooden goose decoy. $50. The seller, an old-timer named Murphy, swore this was the hissing goose. Ugly as sin, but supposedly important. Murphy claimed his grandfather bought it from the original owner's estate in 1931. Too ugly for house, so hiding in back of garage. Mary must never know I spent $50 on this monstrosity. I read it again, then a third time. The hissing goose. I slowly raised my eyes to the ugly waterfowl sitting by the door. That thing that Richard had literally kicked aside with his fancy boots. The thing he'd called worthless. Not even good for firewood. The hissing goose. My hands were shaking. Not from my heart condition. This was something else. Richard had missed something. The expert, the consultant, the man who valued my father's entire life's work at $5,000, had kicked aside something my father had specifically documented, something he'd hidden, something he'd spent $50 on in 1972, which was real money back then. I looked from the ledger to the goose, from the careful handwriting to the moss-covered monstrosity. It wasn't just trash. It was a find. I didn't sleep that night. Not a wink. My hands were shaking, but not from the heart condition. This was something else. Something cold and electric running through my veins. The hissing goose. What the hell was a hissing goose? At 5 a.m, I drove to the high school. The janitor knew me, let me in early. I needed the library computer. My home dinosaur could barely load email, let alone do actual research. I sat down at one of those ancient Dells the school board kept promising to replace and typed into Google, hissing goose Joseph Lincoln decoy. The screen filled up like someone had opened a fire hydrant of information. Articles, auction records, museum archives. My breathing stopped. Holy Mother of God. Joseph Lincoln, master carver from Accord, Massachusetts. Active from 1890 to 1925. His decoys were considered the pinnacle of American folk art. And the hissing goose? That was his masterpiece. His Mona Lisa. The one piece every serious collector dreamed about finding. According to the articles, Lincoln carved it in 1898 for a wealthy Boston banker. It was called the hissing goose because of the way he captured the bird mid-threat display. Neck extended, mouth open, wings slightly raised. Aggressive, alive, unlike anything else from that period. The last confirmed sighting was at the Marshfield Museum in 1930. Then a fire destroyed the entire waterfowl collection. The hissing goose was presumed lost forever. For 95 years, it had been the holy grail of American decoy collecting, and had been sitting in my garage under bird crap for 50 years. I took photos with my phone. Terrible photos. The thing barely had a camera, more like a potato that occasionally captured light. Dark, grainy, with that awful flash that made everything look like a crime scene. But you could see the shape, the pose, that distinctive aggressive stance the articles described. I found the email for Americana Auctions, the biggest auction house in New York. They specialize in American folk art. I attached my terrible photos and wrote, possible Joseph Lincoln hissing goose, found in deceased father's collection. Then I waited. 1 day, 2 days, nothing. I started feeling like one of those people who thinks they found the Virgin Mary in their toast. Maybe Dad had been conned. Maybe old Murphy in Barnstable had sold him a story along with a piece of junk. Maybe I was just a desperate old man seeing millions where there were only splinters. On day 3, an email appeared. Mr. McKinnon, could you please send photos of the underside of the base? An approximate weight. I drove home, took more terrible photos, weighed the thing on my bathroom scale. 12 pounds. Solid wood. I sent everything back. 3 hours later, my phone rang. A woman's voice, professional but with an edge of excitement she was trying to hide. Mr. McKinnon, this is Eleanor Hartwell from Americana Auctions. I'll be at your residence tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Please don't clean or alter the piece in any way. The next morning, Eleanor showed up in a rental car. She was everything Richard wasn't. Quiet, methodical, respectful. She wore simple clothes and sensible shoes. She looked like someone's librarian aunt, except for her eyes. Her eyes were sharp as surgical tools. She didn't touch the goose at first, just looked at it, circled it like a cat stalking prey. She had a UV light, examining every inch. She took microscopic samples of the moss. She photographed it from 50 different angles with a camera that probably cost more than my truck. Finally, after an hour of this, she put on white cotton gloves and very gently, like she was handling a newborn, cleaned a small section of the base with something from a tiny bottle. She leaned in close, then closer. When she stood up, her hands were trembling. "Mr. McKinnon," she said, and her professional voice cracked slightly. "Your father found it. This is a hissing goose. See here." She pointed to the base where she'd cleaned. Jill, 1898. That's Joseph Lincoln's maker's mark. I had to sit down. The milk crate creaked under me. "The museum fire," I managed to say. Eleanor smiled. "The records were wrong. Or someone at the museum made a switch before the fire. Insurance fraud was common during the Depression. Either way, this is authentic. This is the only known hissing goose in existence." "What's it worth?" I asked, though the words felt strange in my mouth. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Professional assessment battling would barely contain excitement. Conservative estimate? $2.5 million. At auction with the right buyers. She paused. $3.5 million. Maybe more. This is a once-in-a-lifetime discovery. Mr. McKinnon, your father, he had an incredible eye. $3.5 million. For something Richard had literally kicked with his boot. I told Eleanor everything. The heart surgery. The $80,000 I needed. The $5,000 Richard had paid for the entire collection. How he called the goose worthless trash. Eleanor listened without interrupting. When I finished, she pulled out her phone and made a call. I could only hear her side, but it was clear she was talking to someone important. A lot of "yes, sir," and "I understand," and absolutely unprecedented. She hung up and looked at me. "Mr. McKinnon, given the circumstances and significance of this piece, Americana Auctions would like to offer you an immediate advance against a future sale. We'll cover all your medical expenses, every penny. We'll also provide our legal team for any consultation you might need." The relief hit me like a physical force. I could breathe again. Actually breathe. The surgery was covered. I was going to live. But then something else occurred to me. That duck, the one Richard had valued at $100 but kept for himself. "Eleanor," I said, "you know the antique world pretty well, right? Ever heard of a dealer named Richard Pemberton from Boston?" Her face changed. It was subtle, but I caught it. The same look you get when someone mentions their ex who keyed their car. "Oh, yes," she said carefully. "He's known in our circles, particularly for his quick flips." "Why?" I told her about the duck, how he'd said it was mass-produced tourist bait, how he'd kept it anyway. Eleanor pulled out her tablet. A few taps, and she turned it toward me. There it was, Richard's own auction site. And right there, lot number 1, exceptional Elmer Crowell pintail drake. Starting bid, $110,000. Elmer Crowell. Even I knew that name. The master carver from East Harwich. His ducks were decoy collecting what Babe Ruth cards were to baseball memorabilia. "That's my duck," I said. "That's my father's duck." Eleanor studied the listing. "Posted yesterday. Auction ends." She checked her watch. "In 6 hours." I called Sarah. "Honey, I need you to come over. Right now. And come alone." She made it in 40 minutes, which meant she'd broken every speed limit between Boston and here. She burst into the garage, face flushed, probably thinking I was having a heart attack. "Dad, what's wrong? Are you okay? Richard said you called him yesterday about the garage and sounded confused." I hadn't called Richard. Interesting. "Sarah, I want you to meet Eleanor Hartwell from Americana Auctions." Sarah's confusion deepened. She looked between us, then at the goose, which Eleanor had partially cleaned. Even half covered in grime, you could see it was something special. Eleanor explained, calmly, professionally. Joseph Lincoln, the hissing goose, the museum fire, $3.5 million. Sarah's face went through a series of expressions like someone channel surfing through emotions. Confusion, disbelief, understanding, and then something else, something harder. "But Richard said it was worthless," she said quietly. "Richard was wrong." Eleanor said simply, "He's an expert. He would have known. He..." Sarah stopped. You could see the wheels turning. "He made a mistake." I turned my laptop toward her. Richard's auction site was still up, the crowled duck staring back at us. The current bid was at $90,000. Did he make a mistake about this too? I asked. Sarah stared at the screen, at the duck Richard had valued at $100. The duck he'd taken for $5,000 along with everything else. The duck now being sold for 100 times what he'd said it was worth. "That's Dad's duck," she whispered. "Yes." Richard said it was mass-produced. He lied. The word hung in the garage like a physical presence. Sarah's face had gone pale. She looked at the $5,000 check still sitting on my workbench, then at the screen where the bidding had jumped to $95,000, then at me. We watched the final minutes of the auction in silence. Eleanor, Sarah, and me clustered around my ancient laptop like people around a campfire. The numbers kept climbing. 100,000, 110,000, 115,000. Sold. $122,000. Sarah made a sound I'd never heard from her before, like all the air had been punched out of her lungs. She sat down hard on the concrete floor, still staring at the screen. "He knew," she said. "He knew exactly what it was worth." Eleanor stepped outside to make some calls, giving us privacy. I sat down next to my daughter on the cold garage floor. For a while, neither of us spoke. "I'm such an idiot," Sarah finally said. "No, honey, you trusted your husband. That's what you're supposed to do. He stole from you. When you needed heart surgery, he stole from you." "Yes." "What kind of person does that?" I didn't answer. We both knew what kind of person does that. Sarah pulled out her phone. Her fingers moved across the screen with frightening efficiency. She was texting someone. "What are you doing?" "Getting a divorce lawyer and calling the police." "Sarah." She looked at me, and her face was hard as granite. "He stole over $100,000 from an elderly person who needed medical care. That's not just theft, Dad. That's elder abuse. That's a felony in Massachusetts." Eleanor had said something similar about legal consultation, but hearing it from my daughter was different. 2 weeks later, I was in the hospital. The advance from Americana had covered everything: the surgery, the recovery, even a good room with a window. Sarah stayed with me the whole time. We didn't talk about Richard. We didn't need to. The divorce papers she'd filed spoke loudly enough. The surgery went perfectly. The surgeon said my heart looked like it had been waiting for this, like it knew help was coming. I told him it probably did. Hearts know things brains are too smart to understand. While I recovered, Eleanor and her team prepared for the auction. The hissing goose had been authenticated by 3 independent experts. The story had leaked to the press. Lost masterpiece found in main garage, and the collecting world was going insane. The auction was set for a month after my surgery. I was healthy enough to attend. Sarah drove me to New York, both of us quiet during the 5-hour trip. She'd been quiet a lot lately. Processing, I think, rebuilding her understanding of the world. The auction house was packed. Eleanor had warned me it would be. The hissing goose was a centerpiece, displayed in a climate control case like the crown jewels. They'd cleaned him properly, and my God, he was magnificent. Not beautiful. Richard had been right about him being ugly, but magnificent in his ugliness. Fierce, proud, uncompromising. The bidding started at $1 million. It was over in 12 minutes. 2 collectors, one from Texas and one from Japan, battled it out like gladiators. When the dust settled, the hammer came down at $3.1 million. $3.1 million for something that had sat under bird crap for 50 years. The story hit the newspapers that afternoon. The hissing goose surfaces after century, and Maine teacher finds $1 million duck in my personal favorite. Forgotten treasure saves teacher's life. That evening, back in my hotel room, my phone rang. Richard. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. He was talking before I could say hello. Fast, desperate, words tumbling over each other. He hadn't known. It was a mistake. The moss had obscured everything. We were family. We could work this out. We could share the profits. It was really our discovery since he'd helped clean out the garage. I hung up. He called back immediately. This time I let go to voicemail. An hour later, he was at my hotel. The desk called up to ask if I wanted to see him. I said yes. I wanted to see what $3.1 million of regret looked like. He looked terrible. Unshaven, red-eyed, his expensive clothes wrinkled like he'd slept in them. The cologne was gone, replaced by the smell of desperation. He started talking the moment he saw me. The same song, just louder. He hadn't known. Couldn't have known. Nobody could have known. It was unfair to blame him. We were family. You took the Crowell duck, I said quietly. He stopped mid-sentence. What? The duck you said was worth $100. You sold it for $122,000. That was different. That was business. No, Richard, that was theft. And when you steal from someone over 65 who needs medical care, it has a special name. Elder abuse. It's a felony. His face went white. He started to speak, but the elevator dinged behind him. Sarah stepped out, and with her were 2 Boston police officers and a lawyer from Americana Auctions. Richard tried to run. He actually tried to run. Made it about 10 feet before the officers stopped him. They were very professional about it. Quiet, efficient, like they'd done this before, which they probably had. Richard Pemberton, one of them said, "You're under arrest for financial exploitation of an elderly person and grand larceny." The divorce was finalized 3 months later because of the proven fraud. The prenup Richard had insisted on was void. Sarah got everything. The house, the cars, the investment accounts. Turned out Richard had been stealing from a lot of people. I was just the one who'd caught him. He pled guilty to avoid trial, got 2 years in minimum security, and had to pay restitution. The $122,000 from the duck, plus penalties. His reputation in the antique world was destroyed. Last I heard, he was selling insurance in Rhode Island. The auction house took their commission, of course, and taxes took their bite. But when everything was settled, I had enough to fix the heart, pay off the house, and set up a nice fund for Sarah. And I kept enough to properly restore my workshop. I'm there now, actually, working on a piece of cherry wood, thinking about grain and value and the things we leave behind. Dad's ledger sits on my workbench, next to a photo Eleanor took of the hissing goose before it sold. Richard had been so proud of his expertise, so certain he could spot value at a glance. He'd grabbed the shiny duck and kicked aside the ugly goose. He'd seen what gleamed and missed what mattered. But that's the thing about real value. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't gleam or shine or beg for attention. It sits quietly under layers of grime and time, waiting for someone who knows how to really look. Dad knew how to look. He saw past the bird crap and moss and found something everyone else had given up for dead. He couldn't leave me money. Forest rangers don't get rich. But he left me something better. He left me possibility disguised as junk. In woodworking, we have a saying, the value of wood isn't in the varnish, it's in the grain. You can polish garbage all you want, but it's still garbage. And you can bury oak under paint and dirt, but underneath, it's still oak. Richard thought he was the expert, thought he could judge everything by its surface. But he'd forgotten the most important rule, the one I teach every kid who walks into my shop. Measure twice. Cut once. Look carefully. Look again. Because once you make that cut, once you dismiss something as worthless, you can't take it back. The best revenge? I didn't have to do anything. I just had to step back and let Richard's greed do the work. He stole the duck because he thought I was too stupid to know better. He kicked the goose because he thought ugly meant worthless. $3.1 million worth of wrong. And somewhere I like to think Dad is laughing. The forest ranger who spent 30 years being called a junk collector. Turns out he was the smartest man in the room all along. He just had the wisdom not to mention it.